morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Joining me today on this topic that we will be discussing is Micah Current, my co-host, who you won't be seeing his picture. He is taking care of his daughter right now. So Micah, have you wrestled your daughter down, or what are you doing right now?
No, she just woke up from a nap, so we're kind of having a stare down face to face at the moment. Um,
Awesome.
but I saw a video on Instagram or Facebook or something the other day, and I showed my wife, and I'm like, "This is going to be 100% me and our daughter." And it was a video of a guy like RKOing his kid through a cardboard box,
Oh,
or
funny.
power bombing his kid through the box, or letting their kids jump off of the couch through the box with their dad laying on it. And yeah, that's 100% going to be me.
Yeah, absolutely,
have you
absolutely.
have you done any of that with your kids?
So there's a couple times where we'll do some wrestling with both Peter and Lizzie, and I don't do stuff like power bombs because when they get picked up too high, they get very scared. So we just kind of like more grapple. But there's times where I've gotten Peter in we call it the avocado squeeze because they curl up into a ball and then I like squeeze them, and then I'm like squeezing them real tight and I wrap my arms and legs around them. I'm like, you gotta submit, uncle, uncle. Or I do the tickle pickle, which sounds like a very bad wrestling move, but it's when they're straight, like they're stiff as a board, and then I wrap around them and I have their arms and their legs tied together. So then I just got their side exposed and I just start tickling their side and they start laughing. I go, I'll stop if you say uncle. And they say, okay, I give up. You got to tap, and they'll tap. And then it's like I win. So that's kind of the extent of my wrestling moves. It's usually grappling and tickling, and that's kind of it.
Well, I mean they're kind of old enough, but they're not quite old enough. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Um, so it's been great. And I think, right now, just you hanging out with your daughter right now, like that, those are kind of those wonderful moments that you'll have, especially before they start making noises and start talking back to you and start complaining and rolling their eyes. So this is great. This is a
Or or
great
won't
moment for you.
or won't get off their tablets or their
Or
Nintendo Switch, or they fight you about their screen time, or
or they
they
argue with you,
don't
how
want to
come
do
you
their homework.
why won't you let me play this game? Well, because you're not old enough. That's why you can't play this game. You're not a
Tell them
teenager.
Tell them when they can beat some of the original NES games on the original Nintendo, then we can have a conversation.
Oh, I've done that with Peter a couple times. Like, hey, if you want to play this game, you got to play the original. You need to appreciate where the series has gone from, and he'll do
Or
it.
what you could do is, wasn't it you that told me that you used to play like Mario 64 in college and just like destroy people?
Mario Kart 64. I just smoke everybody.
Yeah,
No one
that's what
could
I meant.
beat
Mario
me.
Kart.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you should do to Peter. Just
Oh, well, he's
I'm
actually
assuming
getting
you.
good. He's actually beaten me in Smash Brothers a couple times.
Well, I'm
Very,
assuming you guys have the. I don't have it, but didn't they come out with the Mario Kart for the Switch a couple years back?
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm assuming you guys play that.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've done that. Yep. All right. So, friends, today I know the last couple sessions we haven't done Stories Gone Wild because we just had some really big, interesting topics to talk about. And it's like, we just want to make the most of our time. Not saying that when we do Stories Gone Wild, it's like we have the garbage thing we're talking about, um, but I'm but Micah, you sent this to me probably a couple weeks back. It's an article from the Religious News Service, and the date was July 11th of this year. And it's about a guy named Reverend Thomas J. Oord, who is a professor, a doctorate professor at I have to figure out what at one of the Nazarene universities. It's an online thing. He was at Northwest. He was at Northwest Nazarene University, but he was pushed out in. It says pushed out in 2015, but he is now working at. Northwind Theological Seminary, which is an online only school for that's tied to the Church of the Nazarene. So why he's kind of in the news is he has been open and advocating for LGBTQ affirmation within the Church of the Nazarene. He has written vocally, he has communicated that, and even written like theological articles with other theologians within the Nazarene Church, some in other denominations, kind of giving a theological response or theological basis on why churches should be affirming of LGBTQ people. So that's kind of where it is. But the head denomination of the Church of the Nazarene believed that his teaching is contrary to the teachings of the Church of the Nazarene. And he has been charged with conduct unbecoming of a minister for his efforts in trying to move the denomination to affirm LGBTQ people. And he had a trial set date on July 25th of 2024. And basically, if he's found guilty, he could lose his preaching credentials and probably even his church membership. So for him, what that would mean for those of you who may not know what that means he would no longer be a member of the Church of the Nazarene. For churches that do have membership, he would lose his membership. He would lose his ordination. And by losing his ordination, that means that he would also lose his job as a professor of a Nazarene university, because all that stuff's kind of tied together. So this was kind of a big deal. So Micah, you said this to me, and I've read through it, and I was just kind of wondering, initially when you read this, and again, it's been a while ago, but while you're reading this, like, what were some of your thoughts on why you said send this and why you thought, hey, maybe this is a topic we need to discuss?
Well, first, with our conversations, even going back with Karma and was it Nick? Was the
Yeah,
other
Karma
guy?
and Nick. Mm-hmm.
The folks from Chaga Firm. I really want to know what the definition of affirm is.
Mm.
And when I read this and was looking at this, the the thought comes to mind, what does affirmation of LGBTQ mean? And the church and reference to the church or light of the church. And I still don't know, right? Like, if affirmation to me, the way that I look at the word affirmation is that, like, we're affirming who they are and accepting who they are.
Mm-hmm.
But does that mean we should do same-sex marriages, like as pastors?
Mm.
Does that mean we should, perform their weddings, be okay with them adopting children? Can they serve in the church? There are a number of different things, like, or is it just simply, like I said before, are we just affirming and you know affirming in the sense of, okay, do we just accept them and meet them where they are and walk beside them and with them as they are either just going to continue living a life of the LGBTQ community,
Mm-hmm.
or are they going to surrender that or give that up, or live an abstinent lifestyle, or not act on their feelings and just walk beside them and counsel them and lead them. I just really want to know what the definition is going to be. And so, like, when I sent you this, and then when you and I just talked before we hit record, this guy, this theologian, doctor, professor, um, part of the Nazarene community, lost his credentials. He lost his preaching
Yes.
license. He lost his membership
Mm-hmm.
of the church. And so, like, he went on trial, which when I read it, I'm like, since when does churches start putting pastors on trial? like it's the
Well,
Supreme Court or something.
yeah. So you really have brought up a lot of questions, and there's a lot to unpack. And I think probably the simplest thing is I think it's hard to define what affirming means, right?
Yes.
Because, you know, when you talk to
Because
people,
you and I've had several conversations about this, Scott, and it's like
yes,
we're how many years have we been doing this podcast together, and we still don't know what the word affirmation means in respect to the LGBTQ plus community, and
yeah.
it's mind blowing to me.
Well, and I think a lot of it depends on, and I think a lot of it is, unless the way it's going to be defined is it has to be defined by, I think that word has to be defined by the uppers, by the upper echelon of a denomination when it in regards to the church and LGBTQ community. Because so let's say, for an example, if the Church of God Anderson comes out with a statement saying, by affirming, we believe that every person is a child of God. And they may even put like a quote to their hymn page number for the child of God hymn that they sing. And it may put some scripture there. And their big thing may be like that everybody who is part of the LGBTQ is welcome into a Church of God Anderson Church of God. And that may be the statement. Now, when you dig a little deeper, if you start asking questions like, oh, well, can people of LGBTQ serve as an usher, serve in children's ministry, serve in youth ministry, be ordained as a pastor, then that may be kind of where you're going to have to really think. Affirming means we love you. We want you to come to our church. You're welcomed here. We affirm you. We see you. We love you just the way Christ loves you. At the same time, you cannot be a pastor. And you make that clear line. And once you say, this is our definition of affirming, then that's kind of when you're going to say, okay, am I going to be a part of this congregation? Am I not? Same thing with the Nazarene Church. What is your definition of affirming? Is your affirming mean that people from the LGBTQ community can be ordained as ministers and serve in the church? Like that's kind of really the definition that people have to really figure out on what affirming is. And I think because the conversations we've had with Cog Affirm, and even kind of, it's very much like, okay, well, we still don't know, because it almost sounds like to me, like if I was to interpret all the conversations and correspondence we've had, it almost sounds like we want to make sure that the Church of God is a safe place for LGBTQ people to worship. And we want to have that conversation. And that was kind of what I walked away from it. They just want to have the conversation. They don't want to try to go to GA and change rules. They just want to have the conversation. And what we've seen from that within the Church of God is people just wanting to have a conversation have gone to trial and lost their credentials, because
or
they want
signed
to
a
have
piece of paper and lost their credentials,
or sign a petition and they lost their credentials, even though they have not done anything, or they haven't like Thomas Oord has, which has written articles and books on the topic as a Nazarene
they haven't
minister.
performed a same-sex marriage ceremony.
Yeah, exactly. So with that, like just within the article, like here's some interesting things about this. So you mentioned the other thing about when do we start putting pastors on trial? That's the one thing that I think I'm very more curious about than the LGBTQ thing, is the fact that he's going to be put on trial. It even said that the church tried to gag him, put a gag order on him, that he couldn't speak about anything until his upcoming trial. But he decided, hey, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to speak publicly. So he published a book called My Defense, Responding to Charges That I Am a Fully Affirmed LGBTQ plus people. And so he wrote this article, and I haven't read the article, so I don't know what he wrote in there. But his big thing is like, no, we're not going to live. I'm not, and his words, and this is from the other article, which I'll read. I'm not going to kind of stay in the closet, so to say. I want to communicate it because, as being in the Nazarene Church for 30 years as a minister, doing ministry in Nazarene Church 30 years, and especially being in higher ed, within Nazarene biblical institutions, there's been some LGBTQ people who are kind of lost. And for him, he was able to pray with them, minister to them, help them to be able to, not navigate not only some of the struggles they had with their sexual identity, but also the big thing was communicating to them that there is a God that loves you. And that's kind of something that I've seen in this thing. Even the book that he wrote, Why the Church of Nazarene Should Be Fully LGBTQ plus Affirming. Not only did he wrote with other theologians, but also his daughter wrote an article in this book too, who is bisexual, according to the Religious News article. And at the end of this article, it goes, I really want to see the denomination live up to the calling of love that it claims that we're trying to pursue, Oord said. It is my belief that love requires people who are trying to be followers of Jesus to be fully affirming of queer people. Quote from Oord. So that's kind of was the article. And again, Religious News is just communicating that. So again, we don't know. He has his trial. Well, fast forward, and this was published. Actually, it was updated on September 2nd, 2024. And this is actually written by Thomas Oord to Newsweek. Basically, the headline is, I was expelled from my church. I was found guilty, but I do not feel sorry. And he writes, and here's what he writes, and it's going to be lengthy, so I do apologize for those of you listening. But I think it's important just to read this so that we can kind of understand a little bit about the process he went through of these trials that he went through. So this is Oord writing. In July of 2024, I underwent an official heresy trial initiated by the Church of the Nazarene, the denomination in which I was ordained as a minister more than 30 years ago. I was charged with teaching against church doctrine and misconduct for calling the church to become LGBTQ plus inclusive. The trial verdict, guilty. According to the discipline committee's trial report, my crimes include having sown deep seeds of confusion and division and leading people away from sound doctrine. According to the ominously written decision, the seriousness of offenses cannot be overstated. Only eternity will show how many souls have been led astray through his false teachings. So this was the letter he got after his trial saying, we find you guilty, and basically we'll know how serious this your infraction is based on how many souls have been led astray through your false teaching. So there we go. He writes, I was ordered to surrender my minister credentials and my church membership was taken. In technical terms, I was both defrocked and excommunicated. I'm going to pause right there. Any thoughts with that before I keep reading this article? His response.
I know this isn't the topic that we're talking about,
Yeah.
but a lot of people struggle with church hurt and struggle with feeling like they're not part of the church because of things that they went through or things that people have said about them, whether it's, I don't know, a marriage affair, abuse in the relationship, abuse to your children, whatever it may be, drugs, alcohol, etc. I think of those things and I'm like, you kick this guy out after serving the church for 30 years? And I struggle with the idea of like, oh, you're calling it a heresy trial? And it's like, it's like, what are we in 1594? Like, it's just, I have my opinions about the topic at hand. However, what's the definition of theology, Scott?
Yeah.
And how does one become a quote unquote theologian and a scholar and somebody who's studied the Word of God, studied and taught and, XYZ. And yes, there are things in life, such as pastoring or teaching, in a higher education setting where there needs to be some accountability. And if you're going against the grain, then you need to have that conversation. But to have a full blown trial,
yeah,
right? Like it just seems like what did he, like how you turn on like, I don't know, Fox News or CNN or whatever, and Congress or the United States Congress is having like a trial or a hearing with somebody. That's what I imagine this guy went through. He went in front of like the National Church of the Nazarene Congress, if you will, and had a trial. And this is, the result of that. And um,
Mhm.
I just really struggle with the idea of somebody, if somebody thinks different than me or believes differently than me or has a different opinion than me, it doesn't mean I'm just going to like oust them
Yeah.
or like you're not welcome here or you know we're in a heightened political season as we speak, but like I have several coworkers who are extreme one way and extreme the other, and it's like it's a super like walk on eggshells kind of environment right now. And so like it doesn't mean I can't work with them. It
Yeah. Yeah.
doesn't mean I
So,
don't care about them or love
hmm
them.
oh yeah. Yeah. And I'm agreeing with you. Like the whole trial thing is very odd. But I'm
Well, in the
gonna
Church of
read.
God, apparently the Church of God, you mentioned that earlier with the Church of God people that decided to
Yeah.
chug Affirm website, like some of the folks that lost their credentials, they didn't have a trial. They just you're like you lost your credential,
Yeah.
or did they? Did they?
They probably got a letter in the mail saying you lost your credentials. Done. And that's it. Um, yeah,
That's a very Church
so
of God thing to do. They probably got an email through Atlas.
oh, and it probably got in the spam folder too. Yeah, geez. Anyway, yeah, 10 years later, I'll get an email that just magically appears that I lost my credentials 8 years ago. It's like,
And
oh,
you've been
I'm
paying
still
for them
paying my
for eight
dues. I'm
years.
still paying for my dues. I still have a current, like, I don't know. Anyway, here's what here Ord continues to write. He goes, losing my religious identity is a big deal to me. Church has always been the center of my life for as long as I have memories. I faithfully went to Sunday school and church camps as a child. I attended a Christian college, graduated from seminary, and taught religion for 20 years in the denomination's universities. Few people have been more invested in the Church of the Nazarene. I changed my mind about queer issues over 30 years ago. I became queer affirming after reading scripture and thinking through the central arguments. I decided to stay in the denomination. I wanted to help queer kids and bring change from within. In the past 30 or so years, I felt a little guilty that I could not be more open about LGBTQ plus matters, but the payoff was helping my university students come to terms with sexuality issues and teaching them about a loving God. In 2021, a conservative group brought charges that I was queer affirming. They had plenty of evidence because over the past 10 years or so, I have become public about my views. I was writing books and articles advocating for full queer inclusion, and I talked often about inclusion on podcasts. The most blatant advocacy for queer people came in a massive book I edited with my daughter Alexa that we called Why the Church of Nazarene Should Be Fully LGBTQ Affirming. The book included more than 90 essays from queer voices, allies, and scholars advocating for queer inclusion. To critics, the book represented heresy of the highest order. To queer people and their allies, it represented tangible hope that love may prevail in a church long known for following rules. In the summer of 2023, I was given charge that led to my trial in summer of 2024. The first act of the disciplinary committee in my case was to say I could not talk to anyone about the trial. I wanted transparency, so I told them I would not comply. I then published my defense as a book called My Defense a month before the trial. I also shared email correspondence and took my case and the situation to social media. I did this in part because my conversations with queer people had convinced me that opening the process to a public spotlight was more likely to bring positive change. Hiding in the closet isn't healthy. The trial itself was tense, and I'm grateful to my wife for accompanying me. The disciplinary committee was adamant that I and my witnesses could not question the theological basis for my charges. This was ironic, of course, because I was being charged with teaching against doctrine, which is all about theology. When I paraded fellow theologians to testify, it was clear committee members were theological babies compared to me and these leading scholars. But I was found guilty. My ordination was taken and my membership was removed. In an important sense, I failed. I'll stop right there. He writes a little bit more after that. But yeah, thoughts, Micah?
I mean, it's again, it's fascinating, but I really want to know, by queer affirmation or LGBTQ affirmation, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Does that
And
mean we're just gonna be okay with that? Or like, I will be first to say, like, again, not just the conversation about LGBTQ inclusion or LGBTQ, like, being welcome of those groups in our churches. We suck at it. We do a terrible job. It's, a terrible disservice to the gospel of, reaching our hand out to people that need a place to go, a place of refuge. And the same will go for the drug addict or the homeless person or the poor person or the, alcoholic. But like, it just, again, it doesn't really define what, the affirmation means. And, you know,
yeah,
I think that everybody, I know that you're working at a UMC church. I'm not working at a church currently, but I've worked at churches. But like, you know, we tiptoe around the idea of conversations of politics and woke culture and LGBTQ, DEI, whatever it is, and just act like it's okay. When in reality, when you go to have the conversation, it either escalates to something like this, where this guy loses his credentials and has served the church for over 30 years, or we just be passive aggressive about it and don't talk about it at all. Is that
yeah,
like fair? Is that a fair assessment? Like, I mean, it just seems like we are one way or the other. We're like, nope, we're not going to support this, and there goes your credentials if you do, or we're just going to act like it doesn't exist.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I actually pulled up the link to the book that he wrote about why the Church of Nazarene should be fully LGBTQ. And this is just on Goodreads. And, it's sitting at a 4.24 star review with 7 reviewers. That's the 45 ratings, but only 7 reviews. And one of the reviews is from a guy who kind of holds a more traditional outlook on marriage within the Church of Nazarene. And even he says, I found this book insightful as grounds of proving a charitable dialogue within our denomination. So even this guy's like, I believe in a traditional marriage viewpoint. He reads this book and he's like, I think there are some cases that can help start the dialogue, start the conversation to just see where it ends up. It'd be interesting to see if this guy, what he feels about the court that Professor Oord went through, the court of law of Nazarene law. But yeah, it's interesting to see, and even the interesting thing too is just with these writing goes, they're trying to talk about theology, and it seems like, or where was it, like, where he wanted to. Oh, yeah. The disciplinary committee was adamant that I and my witnesses could not question the theological basis for my charges. So he's being charged. And so this is kind of how I'm seeing it. He's being charged that he is saying something that is contradicting with their theological view. And yet he's not allowed to use theology to kind of defend his view and why he thinks that way. So it's like, we're questioning on theology, but you can't use theological arguments on your theology and doctrine.
Which
Which
again makes very little sense.
It makes very little sense. And again, I think it's the question of, and I think this is where the question is, there's a difference between questioning how one thinks theologically. There's also a difference between questioning your doctrine, right? Because if
Yeah.
theology is a study about God, you and me could have different views of God. We can debate that. But at the end of the day, you and me arguing about how we view God and the acts of God and the characteristics of God is not going to get me in trouble with the Church of God Anderson. What will get me in trouble with Church of God Anderson
Maybe.
if as I start maybe, but ideally in a perfect world, in a perfect scenario,
Yeah.
me arguing doctrine, Church of God doctrine, and arguing against it, that's, especially as an ordained Church of God minister, that's what's going to get me more in trouble. Because now I'm challenging the doctrine of which the denomination is kind of held together. So if I'm now poking that, then that's basically kind of like well, if that's something you don't believe, then there's a whole bunch of other denominations that may believe you do that you can be a pastor at. And that's kind of where we look at. So that's kind of the question, because if it's about theology, this disciplinary committee should allow theology. If they're poking holes at doctrine, then that's where I would say the Church of Nazarene says, hey, as of right now, this is what the Church of Nazarene believes, and we don't see it changing anytime soon, our doctrine about this. So, let's go ahead and let's go our separate ways at this point, because obviously you're attacking doctrine, which is what we're really having the issue about. But theology, that's a big question.
Well, let me ask you this. So,
Yes.
you not too long ago, like obviously you're working at a UMC church, and the UMC church recently, like, didn't they split, or didn't they come out and say, "Hey, this is what we're going to do"? And your
So
church did. Your church didn't do that, correct?
my church, the church I'm pastoring at now as the family minister, is still part of the UMC. It didn't split off and go either independent or global Methodist. It didn't. It stayed with the UMC.
But like, it's basically the same conversation. Mine is um, the disciplinary hearings and whatnot. You've got pastors that are coming out and saying, "Hey, we support this, this, and this, and we're going to do this, this, and this," and they're not losing their credentials.
No. And frankly, the whole process with the UMC is, even after the split, the UMC was gracious enough to be able to help, at least this is what I was told, to help the Global Methodist Church kind of help find their, get their offices in order, get their kind of their structure, and then
Get their house in order.
get their house in order, and then transfer those ministers who want to go Global Methodist, transfer their credentials from the United Methodist to the Global Methodist.
Yeah.
So it wasn't
Which,
like these people who left the UMC, they were kicked out. It was like, oh, you believe something different. Okay, let's figure something out. Let's work together. Let's figure out a smooth transition for you to move your credentials and move all your stuff. And even from some of the churches, like church property, because then that's going to be another thing too. Especially if it's conditional deed to the UMC, like, how do we make sure that paperwork's all taken care of? And they try to do it with as much dignity and grace to make sure that transition was as smooth as it could be. I'm sure there's probably some bumps in the road along the way, but at least it wasn't like, okay, well, you don't believe us, get out of here. And they start kicking them out. And now you had all these Global Methodist ministers and churches caught with their pants down trying to figure out what they're going to do. Like, there was some sort of civility in the split.
yeah, and I mean, like, you talk about the United Methodist Church, and we're, in the case here where we're reading this article and going over this with the trial and whatnot with this pastor. Um, you know, I just find it fascinating. You have the UMC Church who split and then gave people the option to do one or the other. They uh, have, like in your case, you're still a UMC church, but you're not. It's kind of like you're just still a UMC church, and you're not like splitting off anyway. But then, like the Nazarene Church, which theologically speaking is very, very close to Church of God in respect to the Wesleyan holiness movement and things like that, and very, very, very close in respect to the different ordinances of faith and theology and baptism and communion and all the ordinances that we talk about from time to time. But it's just fascinating that every church is going through this right now, and we're seeing different results everywhere we go. And you have some churches that are like super extreme, like LGBTQ plus. They go as far as like hanging those flags outside their church. They, they're marrying same-sex couples, and then you have situations like this with this Nazarene professor slash pastor who lost his credentials, lost his license, lost his membership. Like, let's talk about that for a minute. Like, you lose your membership to the church.
Yeah.
Like, like, do they believe he's like a false prophet and he's just like he still doesn't believe in a God that loves him and saves him and that he's saved and born again?
Well, apparently, according to that quote from the Nazarene, they'll see eternity will judge based on how many souls were led astray by his teaching.
What is
So
this, the
that's
Catholic
that.
Church?
Well,
I was being, I'm sorry, I'm
I
being sarcastic when I say that because of, like the whole conversation of
yeah,
purgatory and judgment and things like that. And it's
yeah,
like, how do you know? Like, I
yeah,
don't know what's going to happen to you, Scott, and you don't know what's going to happen to me. Like,
yeah,
we'll just form a committee and tell them what we think.
yeah. I hear you. So, kind of reading Ord's statement to continue what he wrote. He says, "While I'm heartbroken over the verdict, I'm not sorry about all I did to precipitate it. I'm a straight, cisgendered white guy who enjoys a lot of privilege. I consider it a point of pride to have argued for the full inclusion of LGBTQ plus people in the Church of the Nazarene. If loving and advocating for queer people is a crime, then I stand guilty. My ousting will not surprise most queer people. They're accustomed to being judged, condemned, and kicked out. In fact, many people wondered why I would remain in a denomination known for non-affirmation. Others wondered why I chose to endure the pain inherited in the trial process. It would have been easier for me to walk away silently. In an important sense, I was involuntarily pushed out, but in another sense, I voluntarily chose a path I suspect would take me out. I want to see the church I love and for which I have sacrificed to affirm queer people fully. I have my reasons for wanting change. First, I try to follow Jesus and the love he lived and taught. To stay faithful to Jesus, I think traditional Christians must change their views on sexuality. I stayed in part to argue that loving queer people means fully include them in the life and leadership of the church. Second, I endure the trial process because I hope to encourage queer people and their allies. My status as a leading theologian provided a platform for me to advocate for full queer inclusion. I'm happy to report that thousands of queer people and allies sent notes of gratitude. Many say my stand gives hope that others will come alongside them. I've been advocating for loving change for some time, but I did not expect the range of emotions I felt as the process unfolded. Leading up to the trial, I experienced periods of anxiety. This involved shortness of breath, sleepless nights, tensions, and mood swings. I gained weight. I worried about what people would think of me, and then I worrying about what people would think of me. The process was not good for my health. Now that I've been excommunicated, I'm feeling a new set of emotions. On one hand, I feel free. I don't have to cross my fingers when reciting doctrines that make no sense. I don't feel pressure to fall in line with incompetent religious leaders. I'm not worried about using precise language to appease denominational authorities. On the other hand, I've lost a major form of my identity. I'm no longer part of a community that greatly shaped my sense of self. Rather than belonging to a team, I'm now a religious free agent. This loss of identity is a bigger deal than I expected it would be. What I feel most strongly is self-respect. I'm proud to have stood for love. I'm proud in part because I'm convinced Jesus also loves queer people. I think God celebrates queer identities, orientations, and healthy sexual behaviors. So should we. I'm also proud to stand with loving Nazarenes and other religious people in queer affirmation. The consensus in the human scientists, psychology, sociology, medicine, says queer people can live healthy lives. My friendships with queer people confirm this consensus. Many queer relationships promote flourishing. I'm happy to be on the side of health and wholeness rather than secrecy and shame. Despite being excommunicated and defrocked, I'm proud I've stood for love. That's what matters most. I don't know if I'll affiliate with another religious group. Time will tell. Whatever happens, I'm not sorry for doing what love does. And that's the end of the article that Thomas Oord wrote to Newsweek.
Well, I have two questions.
Yes.
One, the first being, he says he believes that Jesus loves queer people.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that Jesus loves queer people, gay
Yeah.
people, lesbians, transgenders, people of the
Uh-huh.
LGBTQ community. I believe that Jesus loves everybody.
Yeah.
However, there's this thing called sin, and I don't think that Jesus loves the sin, right?
Hmm.
And there's this whole expression that it's like love the sinner, not the sin, right? And maybe that's what he's getting at. And then I guess my second question for you, Scott, is if you could ask this guy anything, what would you ask him?
And I think it goes back to reading the article, and I think the question I would ask goes back to the same question we've been asking, like, what do you mean by
Um,
queer affirming fully? Because I mean, for me, when he said queer affirming fully, but then I think what kind of sealed it for me with that question, he said not only in church life, but also in leadership. So
yeah,
with his definition of what he means as queer affirming, um, he means queer affirming as people of the LGBT community can be free to come and worship Jesus Christ in the church, be part of church practice and church praxis and church culture, and also have the opportunities to be in church leadership, both from the local church all the way up to the high leadership within a denomination. So for Oord, he defines, and I think that's the thing that I think is good. He defines what he means by when he says LGBTQ affirming.
sure.
That's his
And so,
definition.
well, and it gets really muddy in other denominations and other spaces when it's like, well, what do you do with people that are gay, or what do you do with people that you know have a history of, what if they're a felon and they spent 15 years in jail? Like, do you let them serve in the local church? And like, it gets kind of muddy when you talk across the board with different churches and denominations, because some churches will say absolutely not, and that's where I think you need to get that. I think that's what he means by we need to, you know, change our views a little bit and be more open. And I agree with that. Like, and it's not just about LGBTQ uh, being the point of conversation for this podcast, but everything.
Yeah.
The songs we sing, the lights we have, the type of church services we have, the ordinances of communion and baptism, the you know the celebration of the resurrection, like all of these different things. Like, I've talked a lot over the last 2 years since you've been at Bexley about what are you teaching? Is it confirmation?
Confirmation. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, Church of God doesn't teach confirmation. It's not even part of
No.
its DNA. Like, it's not even part of the DNA of like what you have to do as a minister in the Church of God. And so I think that there's a lot of folks that are just stuck in the way they do things, and and he's right to a degree. We need to have these difficult conversations regardless of the outcome, and not have a Supreme Court trial of the church to determine whether or not you keep your credentials. Like,
Yeah. And
at the end of the day, Scott, what does this prove other than this guy losing his credentials and his membership? Like, what does it do for the Nazarene Church?
well, here's the thing. It does for the Nazarene Church. I think it does two things. Both, I think, on one hand, what it does for the Church of Nazarene, it's sending a message, right? If you have your top, most invested minister, theologian who has devoted themselves to the Church of Nazarene for 30 plus years, and you're saying this guy's now out because he has a certain belief that contradicted with what we believe as a Church of Nazarene, that's going to send a message to everybody, pastors, professors. It's sending a message to them, which is going to say, if you believe something that is against our teachings, here it is. At the same time, it also puts a lot of scrutiny on them too, and not because of the LGBT, but how they're handling business. Because let's take LGBTQ off the table. Let's say someone has an issue with something, a theological issue about something that the Nazarenes believe, where another Nazarene pastor goes, well, I don't think that's what the Bible's saying or what the Bible teaches, and they counteract that. What are they going to do? Put that person on trial and excommunicate them and kick them out? That has nothing to do with the LGBTQ. And maybe it has to do with maybe the stance on holiness, like holiness to go, theologically, I think holiness is a little bit more conservative than what we believe, or a little bit more progressive than what we believe as a Nazarene church. And you're going to say, oh, well, you're speaking heresy. We're going to kick you out. Like, to me, that's going to put them on scrutiny, because now it's like, okay, who are these people in leadership that feels like it's okay to just start not only putting people on trial because they have different points of views within your denomination, but then when they try to defend themselves using theology, they're saying, nope, you can't use theological arguments to defend yourself. I mean, we're a church. Theology is our thing. Like, for me, I think that's another issue that the Church of Nazarene is going to have to deal with. And I think because of those two things, you're either going to see a lot of people who are going to retract more deeply into their shells if they do have a certain belief about LGBTQ issues within the Nazarene church, or you're going to have people who are going to be more defiant and they're going to be pushing a little bit harder. And then that's when you're going to start seeing, because then if you start ousting ministers of churches and that now becomes an issue, then you're going to have to fill those spots. And again, we live in a time now where a lot of American churches are slowly starting to lose church leaders. And there's a lot of churches that are vacant. And
it's not just because of LGBTQ, it's because of
it's just because
numerous
of times.
Things.
Yeah,
yes.
Numerous things. Because of the times. So now you're getting rid of ministers who may have a certain belief, but they may not be teaching that to their congregation. They may say, I think that we should be more loving to LGBTQ people, but they're not marrying them. They're not writing articles or doing podcasts saying that. That may just be in conversations with colleagues, and all of a sudden we're kicking you out. They're pulling a Greg Locke, get out of my church, kick you out. That's what they're doing. And it's like, that's going to kind of, then you have a vacancy, and now you're kind of like, okay, how are we going to fill these places up? And not only that, it's going to cause a lot of damage. And I think that's always kind of the tricky part with churches. If you have a certain belief on a certain theological statement or a certain doctrinal statement that people are opposing to, and you're not listening to them or not even willing to open up and have the conversation, and then at the end of the day, you could say, well, I've heard, we've talked about that. I understand everyone's points of views. At the end of the day, we're still going to stay the same. I think in some ways there's the respect. I think there's a respect that I was able to listen to somebody who had a different take on a doctrine issue, theological issue. At the end of the day, we're staying the same. And from that viewpoint, you could either stick with the Church of the Nazarene and kind of fall in line, basically, to kind of put it mildly, or we're going to kind of give you the opportunity to go somewhere else. If you want to go UMC, we'll make sure
bow out gracefully.
Bow gracefully, but we'll make sure we do something nice to make you transition to a different denomination to serve that fits with your doctrinal and theological values. And I think that's probably the more Christ-like thing than anything to do. Any final thoughts from you, Micah?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk all day about it. It's very, like, I think churches are going to really have to, and by churches, I mean by all, backgrounds, denominations, whatever your name says on the door, have these conversations, whether it's LGBTQ plus, whether it's, how are we going to, be welcoming to those who maybe have different backgrounds than us, like I think what stood out most to me about what this guy said in that article is that, we need to have a conversation. We need to step outside of our comfort zone. And it doesn't just mean LGBTQ. It means we need to get off of our high horses and love people the way that Jesus did, because they're different than we are. And so I think churches need to really do like what's a good word for it, Scott? Reflection. They need to do a good self-examination of who
Yeah.
they are and what they believe and why. And if it's okay, we don't believe that we're going to affirm LGBTQ plus, then fine, we don't do that. But maybe we need to do a better job of loving people. Maybe we need to
Yeah.
do a better job of welcoming people in our doors and in our churches, regardless of whether it's Methodist or Episcopalian or Lutheran or Nazarene or Church of God or Church of Christ, etc. We just need to do a better job of being welcoming to those who may have a different preference, whether it's sexually or identity or what have you. Um,
Yeah.
it's it's truly fascinating to me that in 2024 we're just now having these conversations.
It's yeah, and I think that's kind of the big thing too. And I'll just kind of, you know, cement and piggyback on you. Like if you're having these conversations, you're saying this is what we believe. You need to make that crystal clear. Because I know there's a lot of churches, or at least the big thing with a lot of churches, especially watching like those like Hillsong documentaries, even though people knew, and then even though, you know, it wasn't explicitly said, people knew that Hillsong was like anti-LGBTQ, but even people who were part of the LGBTQ community went because it was the biggest thing. It's not where a lot of other young people were. It was where they could make friends. It was where all the young people were going to in their community. So they went because they wanted community, but they also knew we are anti-LGBTQ people. So they know that up front. So I think what a lot of churches do is they kind of become very teeter-tottery on topics because they don't want to offend, or they don't want to say, oh no, we don't accept, we are not affirming of LGBTQ people here at this church. And because you're not very clear on that, then I think that causes more damage, because then you have people who think you are and they're all about, they have people who think you are, and then you get into this mess where now there's a conflict, especially when you start having polarization within societies and within politics. And now as a pastor, you're going to have to deal with it, but then you're saying, well, I can't deal with it because it's technically the upper echelon doesn't even know what they're doing about it. So how can I, as a local pastor, make a stance on something when I don't even know what that stance is, because it's still kind of flippy floppy in the upper echelons? And I think that's where denominations need to be crystal clear. What do you believe? And once you know what you believe, then you have to say, okay, how do what we believe and how does our theology shape into practice on how do we love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and how do we love our neighbors? Because we have to be able to, because our theology is going to shape those two commandments that Jesus tells us to do. And if we have
Mm-hmm.
flippy floppy theology, then we're going to be loving flippy floppily too. And that's not going to be good for anyone. It's going to cause a lot of hurt and damage and confusion.
Well, and not to belong or belabor this uh, podcast, but like something that I noticed, I think it was last when did we do GA for nationally? 2 years ago. It's coming up this year, I think.
GA is
Um,
not, no, GA was last year because we talked to one of your friends about it last year. They're doing
well,
regionals this year. So next year will
okay,
be,
yeah. So I did it online, but like it just they were having their General Assembly Q&A forum, but like when people got up to ask those questions, they were like, "We're not going to talk about this at that time." But like, here's what I have to say about that: if this is something that's pressing, whether it's what we're talking about today or not, I think, especially if the way that the Church of God structure is set up, that's like the only time and place that you can air your grievance, like to quote some Seinfeld. Merry Festivus, right? Like if you have a particular, burden on your heart, or need more of a general understanding of what a certain topic of belief is within the Church of God structure, like you said, Scott, you could be pastoring a church of 50 people in the middle of nowhere in Nebraska and not know what to tell your folks about a certain issue and not know how to address it because the national didn't have time to answer your question at GA.
yeah. And I think with that, and we'll kind of close it out with that, with this episode with that. If you make GA,
it's not bashing. It's just something I observed.
It is. You have a correct observation, and I don't see it as bashing. I think if you tout GA as like your main decision maker, because the general director can't make any decisions without the GA, and people want to ask questions because they don't understand certain things about certain policies or certain things that the Church of God is doing, or even how GA is ran or what this is, and you're saying, sorry, we don't have time for that. Like, and then you have to wait 2 years before you can finally, and then again, it's not 2 years that we get to bring this up again. 2 years, the committee of GA gets to decide what topics are going to be voted on. So if you have a question and that doesn't be brought up to vote, then you're still going to be up there asking questions. They're going to say, I'm sorry, we can't talk about now. And I understand, because you're there and you're at GA and you have these sessions going on, like this spiritual type of worship part. And then you have the business side, and you don't want the business side to drag on so long. But I feel like by trying to make sure that the business side is prompt, but you're also denying people to ask questions. I mean, you can try to ask questions and do it in such a way that kind of gets down to the nitty-gritty. Or if someone has a question and you can't answer it now, go, that's a very good question. We cannot answer it now, but maybe we'll answer it tomorrow at our other business meeting, where we can talk a little bit more about that. Or, that's a topic that we'll probably have to address later at the headquarters and try to figure something out, because we really don't have an answer for that. Like, be open and honest. And I think that's kind of where the flippy floppy kind of caused people to lose interest in being part of the denomination, and even being part of working within a denomination, or care what's happening in the denomination or movement, because everything's just so flippy floppy. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. I mean, that's biblical, but you got to stay on task. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no.
I'm going to use that in the social media post later. Flippy floppy. All right. Anyway, so friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. Again, what are your thoughts? We'll have a link to both those articles within the show notes in the description, so you can read it for yourself to make a decision. But again, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll be back on to another episode. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. The Scott Stedman podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for listening.